The last 20 years of my research, I've been paying attention to large-scale engagement strategies as a way to accomplish a number of significant things. And what I've learned about how those do or don't support transformational change and the kind of leadership that's necessary to make that happen is what I'm going to be talking to you today. These are some examples of what I would call transformational change. Hunter Douglas is Windows manufacturing is an outfit in the southern US, primarily employs Mexicans, many of whom are illiterate, was able to engage their workforce in order to produce these sorts of results, which I'm sure you'll see are pretty astounding to do in just 2 years. These results come from involving relevant stakeholders in new conversations about things they care about. Right? And that's the central piece of the message I'm going to give to you today, is that if you want to accelerate transformational change, it needs to engage the people who need to be part of the change. They need to be invited to the conversation about change and offer them real opportunities to innovate from the bottom up. Out in the workforce, the people on the front line have lots of great ideas for simple things that can make a difference. And we find accelerated transformational change happens when that energy and that motivation is unleashed in some way. And creating more collaborative organizing processes that engage everyone will have to make those changes work in proposing the changes they want to make. So this sort of stuff has been going on for quite a while now, but it goes on under a lot of different names. Bob Marshak and I, Bob Marshak's at American University, about 5 years ago, it's 10 years ago now, started exploring what was similar about all these different things, and we came up with this term we call it dialogic organization development. It's not like it's new, but it's still very much an exotic process, and I have some ideas about why that is. For one thing, that list of dialogic organization development processes I showed you a few slides back, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And Bob and I became very interested in why is that? What is going on when they work and when they're not working? What's going on? And one of the things I've become convinced in the data we've looked at is one of the central things that's responsible for whether or not these works is something I'm calling generative leadership. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about for the rest of today, is what is generative leadership and what does that look like? And we've become convinced that generative leaders, the people who can provide the kind of leadership that make these transformational processes work, are operating from a different mindset than what I would call a performance mindset. And a performance mindset is the kind of mindset we need at the front lines. We need to get stuff done. We need to meet targets. We need to hit goals. We need to figure out how stuff's going to happen. And people who are successful doing that get moved up the hierarchy. And the problem is, as you get further away from the front line, many of those sorts of mindsets aren't that effective, particularly for managing transformational change. The generative mindset is not just required of executive leadership. It can be used at a team level. It can be used in chunks of an organization. And what these leaders do, and I love this generator metaphor. It's giving me all sorts of ways to spin this off. These are people who create energy for change. They're like step transformers. They're like dynamos. Like when generative leaders are around, people's motivation and intent and willingness to get engaged in making something happen, just increases. And what they do is they support the emergence of new patterns of organizing and create the condition for new ideas to surface. Because the most powerful force for change is a new idea. Right? And when we face problems, and there are problems that seem intractable, people have been going at them for a while, what makes the difference is a new idea that captures our imagination and makes us want to do something different. And what I've noticed is that typically in a transformational change process, the new ideas that make a difference emerge from within the system. Because when they come from outside the system then you get a lot of that resistance sort of dynamic that goes on. When they emerge from within the system, it might be, it's not a new idea in the history of the world, but in this system it's a new idea and it gains a certain kind of traction. I want to talk about how that happens. And it starts with a fellow by the name of Ron Heifetz, who is the professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He's written a number of books. And he doesn't put it this way, but this is how I reinterpret his work. I would say that generative leadership is necessary for managing something he calls adaptive challenges. And one of, I think, Heifetz's most important contributions to this conversation has been this distinction he's made between technical problems and adaptive challenges. Now, I'll ask you to just take a minute and look at the column called technical problems and look at the problem called adaptive challenges. And notice what's different about those. What's the difference between a technical problem and an adaptive challenge? Taking on of adaptive challenges requires experiments. It requires trying stuff out. And that means there are going to be dead ends and wrong turns, and we'll try stuff and it's not going to work. And if we think that in order to create change, we've got to have the right answer, and it's got to be the right answer, then we get paralyzed by adaptive challenges because, and I'm going to talk about this later, no one initially knows what the right answer is. And finally, and this is really important, right? Any solution to an adaptive challenge is going to create a new problem. This is fundamental to the nature of organizing people, because people aren't simple stimulus response mechanisms. Right? People are messy. Right? Any solution to a problem of organizing creates a new problem. Right? That's just the game. Right? And so some of you have been around long enough, you've probably had this experience of, we decentralize and then we centralize, and then we decentralize and then we centralize. Yeah. Because every time we make one of those moves, we were solving a set of problems that the last thing made, and now but now we create a new set of problems, so we need to go in the opposite direction. That's just the yin and yang of organization. Right? So generative leaders understand this, that any solution to a problem of organizing is going to create a new problem, and therefore any change process is as much to increase the adaptive capacity of the organization as it is to solve that particular problem. That both those things are in operation, and that rather than searching for the answer that's going to solve it all forever, generative leaders search for any answer that stakeholders are willing to move on, to move the ball forward. Secure in the knowledge that organizational change is ongoing. Right? Anyone in this business knows the dirty secret of organizational consulting is that only about 20% of change processes ever actually succeed. And those are ones where you have a lot of leadership involvement. There's been about 3 major studies done in the last 20 years that have come up with the same number. 4 out of 5 organizational change processes fail. However, here's the good news. That sort of result only happens when leaders define the change. Right? We're now, and part of what my research is showing, is that when stakeholders define the change, and by stakeholders I mean the people who are going to be impacted by this change, who are going to actually have to make the change, that are going to have to support the change, when you have those people actually defining the change, not the leaders, but the stakeholders, right? That you actually get lots of successful change. Right? And when leaders lead that process, it almost always works. Here's the good news. You can almost always create transformational change when leaders are leading the process and where the stakeholders are engaged in an effective process of defining what those changes are. So the generative leader, their job is not to say, here's the answer, follow me. Their job is to say, here's the issue, and to hold that space of not knowing and complexity long enough so that we bypass simplistic solutions and create an opportunity where real solutions that can really make a difference emerge. Now, as a result of which, the generative leader doesn't provide the content of change, but they provide the process of change. And they have to, and these things only work when leaders get very involved in that piece of the business of how are we going to orchestrate a set of conversations among which people to get us to a point where new ideas emerge that people are willing to act on to make a difference. And that's what Dialogic OD does, in a nutshell. It's an emergent process where leaders mobilize stakeholders to self-initiate action and then monitor and embed the most promising initiatives that emerge. It's a kind of a bottom-up, leading from behind move. I just recently completed a consultation with a materials construction, very unionized, very cynical, been around a long time. Within 6 months, transformed that culture to the point where the head of supply chain was calling me up going, I just walked into the warehouse, there's guys walking around in the yard, they're changing all the design of the yard so that we can accomplish this goal we have. Nobody told them to do it. And they didn't ask for permission, they're just doing it. Right? He was stunned. Right? Probably you've never heard of Dialogic OD, and not a lot of people have. it's a new label we're using to describe a bunch of things and put it together. But, you know, this stuff's been going on for about 30 years now, and there are hundreds of successful cases, increasing academic research that's showing that this is a much more effective way to transform a system. And yet it's still experienced as exotic by many executives. And one of the questions I started asking myself a couple of years ago is why? Why is that? And I think one of the reasons is because our image of leaders is that they're visionaries, and that if they don't have a vision, they're not leaders. You pick up just about any book or any article on leadership and the word vision pops up. It started around the late 40s. It's become, and if a leader doesn't have a vision, they're not a leader. But see, the emergent change is the opposite. It's not guided by a visionary, but instead by someone who says they don't know the answer. And that's a very courageous act. Talk about daring to innovate. For a leader to get up and say, I know what the problem is, but I don't know the answer. And I want to invite you into this risky emergent situation where I have no control over this. No one, but they're operating out of a mindset that says no one has any control anyway. You know, that's all illusion. But this whole control thing is a way of managing our anxiety. Now, the thing about it is that a lot of people don't like it. Right? I'm studying right now a fellow in Seattle who has been able to create organizations that are employing large numbers of people with intellectual developmental disabilities and do it in a way that creates competitive advantage. These businesses are outperforming their competitors. Right? And he's my poster boy for a generative leader at the moment. Like he lives this complexity stuff, and he lives emergence. And this is the way he's led this organization. And now they're like a social enterprise conglomerate. They've got 6 businesses operating now. But there's a lot of people in that organization who do not understand him and do not like what he's doing and think he's a terrible leader. Right? And in the process of me studying this guy, one of his senior directors took a run at him, tried to get the board to fire him because he's such a terrible leader. Right? And the board doesn't understand what he's doing either. Right? But they got together and they looked at the data and they said, on every measure we have, this organization is doing better than it has ever done in its history. So we're going to stay with them. You know? Right? But it takes an extraordinary person, I think, to have not only that courage, but have that self-possession and say, you know, and this guy is basically retired and took over this thing because he cared about it, but to have that kind of, that place where they're willing to stand in that place of not knowing, of holding uncertainty and complexity and forcing, because he was the kind of, people would come up to him and go, well, is it this or that? And he'd say yes. You know, people hate that. So how do generative leaders transform organizations? So first they identify the adaptive challenge they are personally committed to managing, because this is not going to be a short-term game, right? There's going to be experiments, there's going to be dead ends, there's going to be wrong turns, there's going to be a bunch of small changes that accumulate over time, and you're never going to get it all solved. But you're going to build an adaptive capacity that can keep moving in that direction. They work through change agents. Because they're leaders, they got a lot of other things they got to be doing. So they need a few people who are their folks on the ground, who, and I say familiar with dialogic OD approaches, they don't even need to know the term dialogic OD. They just need to know something about emergent change, and they probably have their own way of talking about it, who work and advise the leader on what to do. Then, together, they use a generative image to frame the challenge in a way that stakeholders care about. The way I would put it with my clients is I say, we need to frame this thing in a way that people would crawl over glass to be part of this conversation. Right? And it starts with figuring out what do people care about, and how do we link that to the adaptive challenge we're trying to manage in some way. And then they bring those stakeholders who will have to meet that challenge into conversations that allow people with similar interests and motivations to find each other. Right? Because usually those are across boundaries, or they're different parts of the organization. Those motivations, those intentions, that excitement already lies latent in the system. It just needs some air, and people need to find each other, and then give those people an opportunity to come up with some innovation or change they want to make happen, and then say, go do it. And they hold that space of ambiguity and complexity and manage the anxiety that creates until new ideas that have a chance of succeeding emerge, thereby stimulating and encouraging as many probes as possible. Right? Little changes to see what works. They don't try to pick winners. Instead, they create a culture of experimentation and learning. So in this warehouse project, we said, you know, we're looking for pilot projects. They don't have to succeed. We don't expect everybody to be successful, but we do expect you to try. and we expect to learn something from this. As it turns out, most of them have been successful. They install processes for monitoring, learning, supporting, and embedding those successful experiments. Right? A process I call tracking and fanning. So it's an amplification strategy to change. You get something small that's working, you find ways to scale it up. And finally, they use the opportunity of managing this challenge to increase the overall adaptive capacity of the organization so that it's making change happen without them making to do anything.